You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Like many Americans, you might have first heard of former Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch when she testified at the first impeachment of President Trump in the fall of 2019.
We'll come to order. Good morning, everyone. This is the second in a series of public hearings the committee will be holding as part of the House's impeachment inquiry.
We were struck by how straightforward she was and how candid she was about what she had experienced.
I was shocked and devastated that I would feature in a phone call between two heads of state in such a manner where President Trump said that I was bad news to another world leader and that I would be going through some things. So it was a terrible moment.
Marie Yovanovitch became ambassador to Ukraine at the tail end of the Obama years. A career Foreign Service officer, Yovanovitch rose through the ranks by serving in places like Mogadishu, Somalia, and in the former Soviet Union as the ambassador to Kyrgyzstan and Armenia. She made fighting endemic corruption and misinformation a priority in each of these posts. That was the agenda she was pushing in Ukraine. When she began hearing whispers from Washington, false rumors spread by people in Trump's inner circle that she was the corrupt one, she was part of the problem. Former Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch joins us now to discuss her memoir, Lessons from the Edge, that infamous Trump phone call, and why she remains optimistic about Ukraine's future. Marie Yovanovitch, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Had you been to Ukraine since the end of your time as U.S. ambassador, or indeed since the Russian invasion in February of last year?
Yeah, so the first time I went back was right before the war started with a group of other people to express our solidarity with the Ukrainian people and to encourage the Ukrainians to prepare. I mean, they were preparing, but publicly, of course, you'll recall that Zelensky was denying the fact that the Russians would invade. And then I went back in September and then again in February for the anniversary of the war. I mean, the 1-year anniversary, or, as some would have it, a much longer anniversary since the war first started in 2014, 2015.
I'm glad you brought up that President Zelensky denied that the invasion was coming, because the Biden administration had done an unusual thing. It had gone totally public with what it had intercepted about Russia's war plans. It made it clear to the Russians that it knew what was up, and it made it clear to the Ukrainians what was up. Was that just a piece of statecraft, or do you think Volodymyr Zelensky really didn't think that President Putin was going to follow through with it?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to know, both publicly and I think in private meetings with our most senior leaders and European leaders. Zelensky was very firm that the Russians were not going to invade. He was very concerned about the Ukrainian economy and what our unprecedented release of intelligence indicating not only what Russian capabilities were, but what their intentions were, what that would do to the Ukrainian economy. And so I think he was very focused on that and trying to reassure his people.
When you left Ukraine, after your time as ambassador ended, Russia and its proxies had already seized Crimea, sought to peel away parts of eastern Ukraine from effective control of the central government. Could you have imagined what began in February of 2022? Had you thought about it all along as a possibility?
So I knew, and I write about this in the book, I knew that Russia had imperial ambitions and was going to continue its aggressive moves. But I was not necessarily expecting a total war on Ukraine. I thought that the war in the East that you referenced, where it wasn't front page news in the United States, but, 3 to 4 Ukrainians died every week, not only soldiers, but sometimes civilians who were, just caught in the crossfire. And I thought that kinetic war, plus the disinformation, the cyber attacks, the economic war, was sufficiently destabilizing from Russia's point of view to Ukraine. So I wasn't actually anticipating that there would be another attack, the full-on war against the people of Ukraine that we've seen over the last year plus.
People who are very familiar with both countries have sometimes admitted surprise sometimes admitted that they didn't think that it would go the way it went. So, no shame in that game if that's where you ended up. But the Russian army has turned out to be surprisingly ineffective. And the Ukrainian army, with plenty of help, granted, has turned into a bulwark, saving the country from a much larger neighbor. Are you surprised?
So as you know, I was in Ukraine from 2016 to 2019, and we were even then providing Ukraine with a lot of what we call training and assistance. So we had the base out in Yavoriv in Western Ukraine, where we trained Ukrainian soldiers, and other countries did as well, especially the British, the Canadians, and others. And in addition, we were providing them with military assistance. So, I knew it was not the military of the Soviet era, right? Which it turns out the Russian military was and is. And so I think combined with new capabilities, new equipment, and the will to fight. I mean, the Ukrainian military knows why it is fighting. It is fighting for their families, they're fighting for their freedom, they're fighting for their future. And they have the entire Ukrainian population behind them. And that is the X factor that you just can't even account for, right? In any kind of military equation. When you talk to military commanders, that's what they're looking for. That's what makes the difference in war.
You are, as many people know, a naturalized American. You chose to become a citizen and chose to enter the country's foreign service and devote most of your adult life to it. This can't have been the way you imagined it ending, but why did you, at the front door, why was this the career you chose?
Yeah, so you mentioned that I'm an immigrant to the United States. My parents grew up in totalitarian countries in Europe before and during World War II. And, they knew what it was to live in fear, even though they were children and teenagers, to not be able to worship the way they wanted to, not be able to say what they wanted to. And when they came to the United States in a journey that was very typical post World War II for thousands of refugees slowly making their way west. But, every story is unique and special, right? Which is part of the reason why I wanted to write this book, because I wanted to honor my parents' story and how special they were. When we came to the United States, they were just so grateful for the sanctuary. They were grateful that there was a place, a safe place, where they could bring up their children in freedom, that we had rights, and they really appreciated that. But they also taught my brother and I that it was important to understand that rights also bring responsibilities. That in a democracy, democracies don't just happen, they need to be tended and defended. And that was our job, the way it is for every citizen. And we got to choose how we wanted to give back, how we wanted to be a part of the great democratic experiment in the United States. And so, as I was growing up, I took a lot of detours, as one does. And, I think detours are a good thing. You learn a lot. You make some mistakes along the way. And you learn from that, too. But eventually, in my mid-20s, I came back to the idea that I had had in high school of joining the Foreign Service, because the Foreign Service was about defending the interests and the values of the American people. It's about history, it's about politics, it's about policy. You get to travel and meet people in different countries and learn their culture, eat their food. For me, this was a passion, right? Things I was really interested in doing. And at the same time, you get to give back to the American people. And so I decided that this was my path. And I took the exam and wasn't initially successful. I failed the first time I took the exam. And I decided that I was going to persist because this is what I wanted to do. And next time I was successful and I continued on my path.
But boy, oh boy, at that time, the Soviet Union was unraveling. Russian speakers were not a dime a dozen. People who had grown up speaking the language and knew it well were certainly valuable to the United States. Your career, after your parents came to North America from the Soviet Union, took you back to the former Soviet Union. What was life like in Armenia and Kyrgyzstan, in places that were learning how to be themselves after so many decades under the Tsarist and then Soviet empires?
Yeah, well, each of those countries, just like Ukraine, are, distinct. They have their own cultures. They have their own way of doing things. Although, as you point out, there was a very heavy Russian and then Soviet overlay on that, particularly in the official parts, the governmental parts, the bureaucratic parts, which you won't be surprised to hear diplomats, sort of interact with that world pretty heavily. But, you go up, I'm just thinking of Kyrgyzstan. Historically, it's a nomadic country. And the herders would follow, the cattle and the camels and the sheep from pasture to pasture and then bring them down into the low fields over the winter. And when you got out of the city, that lifestyle, that way of living, the cowboy lifestyle was still very, very evident. And in fact, one of the best programs that we did in Kyrgyzstan, we often think, when we think about the U.S., of hard power, the U.S. military. But we also have soft power, which is how one influences people, whether it's genes or rock and roll or, people are attracted to these parts of our culture. And in a country as far away as Kyrgyzstan, one of the things that I tried to show the Kyrgyz people is that there are commonalities between American culture and Kyrgyz culture. And so we had a cowboy exchange. We brought cowboys from the United States to Kyrgyzstan, and they put on a rodeo, right? My first rodeo, I have to say. They put on a rodeo, and then the Kyrgyz did their thing, and then they did kind of a joint show. We took it around the country, and it was a huge hit because, first of all, rodeos are fun, but it made the underlying point that we share, the cowboy culture in certain states of our union and the values that that brings, right? The independence, the freedom. And the Kyrgyz really responded to that.
Looking back over that period of post-Soviet history, and especially now that you're out of the service, maybe you can speak a little bit more freely about it. Did the United States play its hand well in that part of the world, both in the republics that spun off of the old Soviet Union and in Russia itself?
Given where we are today, I've thought about this a lot. Could we have done things differently? Hindsight, as they say, is 2020. But when I look back, and now I'm especially thinking about Russia and President Yeltsin and then Prime Minister Gaidar, his first prime minister, the first government of the new Russia, coming to us, not just to us, to the World Bank, to the IMF, to the French, the EU, et cetera, and asking for assistance in transitioning to democracy, to a market economy. And we could have said, no, we're not going to help. You're on your own. We won. Good luck. But we all decided that it was in Russia's interest to transition in as smooth a way as possible to the future, and that it was in our interest as well. Because if Russia became a stable and secure, functioning economy and democracy, that was good for us, good for our businesses, good for our country, because democracies traditionally make our best partners and allies. So we tried to help the Russians. I'm not saying that we did everything right, because we certainly didn't. But again, the decision was, do you want to go really, really fast? Because the window for transformation is always very small, because it is very difficult and the political will starts eroding almost immediately. Or does one want to go slowly? And I think the decision was made by the Russian government, as well as the countries and institutions involved, that it was better to go fast and maybe not have all of the regulations in place that would facilitate some of the changes that were being made. And that created kind of a situation where people who understood what was happening could really take advantage of the system. They were people in the security system, they were people in the mafia, the Russian mafia, and they really took advantage. And it was immoral, it was wrong, it was bad, but it was not necessarily illegal. Those people then became oligarchs. That's what we call them after 1996. And it left a sour taste in the mouth of other Russians, people who had been taken advantage of. And I think one of those people, not that he was taken advantage of, but one of those people, I think, was now President Putin, who was in Petersburg at the time. He was one of the people who was doing well under this new system. But I think he saw these events as what he understood to be Russia's diminution in the eyes of the world as humiliating. And many Russians, I think, agreed with that assessment. And he has been able to, in the later years after he became president, he's been able to harness that resentment in a way that has been obviously very unhelpful, unconstructive.
Was he underestimated or misperceived? He was the former intelligence agent in East Germany, now the right-hand man to the mayor of St. Petersburg, then suddenly at Yeltsin's elbow during the final sort of cratering of the Yeltsin administration. Did America have a good handle on who this guy was and who he was capable of, what he was capable of?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we knew who he was because he was a prominent person in Petersburg, and we had a consulate in Petersburg. And so our consuls general, would deal with him, and they all have their own views about him and his tenure in that office. When he came to Moscow, when Yeltsin brought him in, it was a very, very, very fast rise. So, over a couple of years, I believe. Then all of a sudden he was prime minister, and within months, he was the acting president and then the president of Russia, one of the largest country in the world. And I don't think we had, usually we have decades to kind of look at people who might be likely, presidents of or leaders of countries. I think we had a lot less time to assess him. But initially, I think the reason Yeltsin put him in was because he believed that Putin would protect him and his family after Yeltsin resigned. And Putin certainly did that. Initially, I think Western leaders were hoping that Putin was somebody we could do business with, as was famously said of Gorbachev. And initially, the signs were not bad from an international perspective, from a foreign policy perspective. He started kind of cracking down on the opposition, on the oligarchs, certainly on the Chechens, almost immediately. But from a foreign policy perspective, he seemed like he might be a constructive partner. Russia was working with NATO. Russia was working, bilaterally with countries. We were moving forward on our joint agenda. And so I think there was some hope that Putin would be a constructive partner. But I think that when the so-called colored revolutions occurred, first Georgia, the Rose Revolution, then Ukraine, the Orange Revolution in 2004, then Kyrgyzstan, the Tulip Revolution in 2005. I mean, Putin, who, is an autocrat and does not understand democracy and that people actually have a free will, he didn't understand what was happening. It looked terrible to him where, his fellow rulers were being booted out of office by the people. And so something else, from his perspective, something else must be going on. And I think he decided that, the US and NATO, the West in general, was probably fomenting trouble there. And I think that's when he started turning away from the West with results that we've seen over time, and certainly in 2022.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by World Affairs in San Francisco. Our guest is former Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. Let's go to your time as ambassador. What did Ukraine want from the United States? And what, as you bridged across from Obama world into Trump world, was the United States prepared to give?
Yeah. So the U.S. at that time, and continuing today, the U.S. was the most important partner for Ukraine, bar none. And what Ukraine was looking for in 2016 when I arrived is what it's still looking for, which is assistance with the military fight against Russia, but also assistance in its transition to democracy and market economy. And we were providing assistance in that respect in 2016, and we continue to do so today, although on a markedly more elevated scale, especially on the military side.
When did you realize that the new president that you were serving under had other ideas about how to proceed with Ukraine? This couldn't have been, from what I read in the book, something that was fully understood in its full dimensions right off the bat? Was it more of a dawning realization?
Yeah. So candidate Trump had made some disturbing comments about, Crimea being Russian and things of that nature. He'd also made general comments about the assistance budget generally in the United States and that we shouldn't be providing assistance. He also, as you know, is not a fan of NATO. So that was all out there during the campaign. The Ukrainians saw that and were concerned by that. And frankly, my employees saw that as well. And many of them were very worried that the assistance to Ukraine would be severely curtailed and they would be out of jobs. And there were some concerns, I would say, at the embassy. But for my part, I thought that President Trump would likely be surrounded by traditional Republicans with, traditional views on foreign policy, and that they would, sort of educate, frankly, the president as to why we have the policies that we have and have had in Ukraine since independence in 1991 through, both Republican and Democratic administrations. And as it happened in February of 2018, there was an interagency meeting at the White House as to what our policy should be towards Ukraine. And it was essentially the same policy as before. And towards the end of that year, I would say that President Trump even strengthened it because he allowed the first shipment of javelins to go through. And those, of course, are the tank busting missiles that every American knows now. At the time, it was more of an obscure issue in America. But that was a really good sign and signal, I thought, about our policy, both to the Ukrainians as well as to the Russians.
When did you first realize that you might have, let's say, a more substantial problem, not only in explaining American intentions to the Ukrainians, which I guess that's part of the job, is transmitting what's coming out of Washington to the place where you're stationed, but also a problem with the president himself?
It was just this fog out there that, I would hear from people that people in White House personnel were wondering whether I was doing a good job. That was unusual because, usually White House personnel is focused on much higher level personnel than a career ambassador. But I figured that it was probably in the normal course of events. New presidents often want their own people in place in various jobs, and they have the absolute right to pull an ambassador and put in a new ambassador. So I thought, maybe this is what it was about. But by about December of 2018, I was getting warnings from my Ukrainian counterparts, people in the cabinet, that I needed to watch my back, that former Mayor Giuliani, who did not have a job in the administration but was known to be close to the president, was his personal attorney, that he was working with other people, from the former Soviet space, and that they were looking to replace me and that I would be leaving soon. And so I would go back to Washington and ask, professional Washington, at the National Security Council, at the State Department, am I being replaced? Am I doing something wrong? Should I be doing something else? What's going on? And they were like, no. You're doing a great job. Keep on doing what you're doing. You're doing what we want. And in fact, during this period, in the beginning of March, I was actually asked to extend my tenure by another year. So I was getting very mixed signals. On the one hand, from the Ukrainians, that there are all these people milling around saying I'm going to be leaving. And from official Washington, the people with actually jobs in the administration, I was being told, no, we want you to stay on. But then the prosecutor general of Ukraine gave an interview facilitated by Giuliani with an online outlet here in Washington, and everything broke out into the public. And when I saw, I kind of reviewed everything over the following weekend. When I saw what was out there, including, like a picture of me with a noose around my neck, I mean, it was pretty vicious, and it looked and it felt like a campaign to get me out of the job. And, I asked the State Department to provide a statement in support of me, preferably by the secretary. And, they said, well, let's see if there's anything to this. And, maybe you should put out a statement. And in that statement, it would be good if you would express your support for the president, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, that to me was a loyalty oath. And we don't do loyalty oaths to a person in the United States. We got rid of that with the American Revolution. We express our loyalty and pledge our loyalty to the Constitution. So I felt I was kind of stuck, that I was being abandoned by the State Department. I marched on, but within a couple months, I was gone.
You write in the book about your realization that you were playing to an audience of one. Presumably that's Donald Trump. Once that realization was there, did you kind of think you were in a no-win situation, that this timeline was going to end with you being fired?
Well, things kind of went up and down. So for a while after that, very tumultuous weekend and no kind of expression of support from the State Department, I thought, something's going to happen, something's going to break. And then it didn't. Everything quieted down for a while. And then all of a sudden, in April, I got a phone call from the head of personnel at the State Department saying I had to leave, and I had to leave immediately. And I have a feeling, when I did come back to the State Department and asked what was going on, the deputy secretary said that the president was going to pull me out. And the secretary did not want me fired by tweet, that this was to protect me.
Just so I understand the dynamics of the situation, you are a career Foreign Service officer. It's been decided that you would no longer serve in Kyiv. You held ambassadorial rank. You've still technically got a job, right?
Yes. Yeah, even the president can't actually fire a federal employee. And so I was fortunate that I still had a job. And that job ended up being a return to Washington and working at Georgetown University, which was, very nice for me after the very tumultuous year prior.
So how did it come to happen that you separated from government service? Was it your call?
So yes, I retired in January of 2020. So when I came back to the United States in May of 2019, I was a wreck. I didn't know what had just happened to me. I didn't know what was coming next. I was very worried that I would never be able to find a job again. And so I wanted to stay in the State Department for as long as I could, until I kind of figured out the lay of the land. But then the perfect phone call, so-called perfect phone call, happened between President Trump and President Zelensky. And that conversation, where famously the president was trading the second shipment of the javelins in exchange for personal and political favors from Ukraine. And what he wanted was dirt on Joe Biden and his family. When that became public, that caused a huge scandal in Washington. There were already investigations by 3 committees in the House, and they turned that into an impeachment investigation. And I and other colleagues were asked to come forward and testify before Congress. And so the State Department and the White House instructed all federal employees, including myself, that we were not to cooperate. And so I had to make a decision. What do you do? You're caught between Democrats and Republicans, you're caught between the Congress and the executive branch, all in advance of presidential elections. I mean, this is not a good place for a nonpartisan career employee to be. There's no roadmap for, what the right thing to do is. And so I thought about what my obligations were. I mean, obviously I had an obligation to the administration, to the president. I also felt I had an obligation to the Constitution and to myself. And clearly the obligation to the Constitution, held precedence over the obligation to the administration. The idea that Congress, a co-equal branch of government, and a branch that is tasked with oversight of executive functions, could not call up career employees, did not seem right to me, especially when we had seen that in practice by both parties over the years. And so I made a decision that, for the first time in my career, I was going to disobey a direct order. But I also had to live with myself. And I felt that this was the right thing to do and that I wouldn't be able to look myself in the mirror if I didn't go ahead and testify. So I testified behind closed doors in October and then publicly in November. And at that point, at least part of my story was out. It felt like I really didn't have a career left in the State Department. And it also felt, because I got thousands of letters from all over the country, that I actually had some support out there. And people were asking me to write a book. And I started being able to imagine kind of a life outside of the State Department and that there might be a future for me. And so in January, I didn't know what that future was going to hold, but I decided that I was going to retire. I couldn't do it before because it felt like I was being chased out of the State Department. But in January of 2020, it felt like I was leaving on my own terms.
As you look back on that decision and on what you said in your testimony, did you have it right? Did you understand the full lay of the land at that point? Would you say anything that you said differently today?
I'm sure if I went through all the hundreds of pages of testimony, there are things I could say better or differently. But overall, even though we continue to find things out because of, investigative journalists and others that are coming forward, overall, I think I got it about right. And I think it was important that we testified.
When I think back to those days, I am struck by the testimony of Alexander Vindman, of Fiona Hill, and Marie Yovanovitch, 3 naturalized American citizens, 3 Americans by choice who had served their country in various capacities for decades in the highest pressure, most exposed arena in our civic life, the attempt to remove an American president from office. That can't have escaped you.
Well, I think there's something special about being an American by choice because we have to think about it. We have to make that conscious decision that this is my country and I want to live by these values. And I want to, tend and defend that democracy. And, all of us in our various ways have done that, especially by working, I think, in the government and trying to promote American interests and American values overseas.
Marie Yovanovitch is the author of Lessons from the Edge. Ambassador, it was great to have you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation, Ray.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Sienna Barnes, and Andrew Stelzer, with special production from Levi Bridges. It was fact-checked by our intern Adam Ailey. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.